All right, our next presentation is the Mayor Richard M. Daley Oral History Project with David Greenstein and Dan Harper. I'm going to turn this over to both of you for our next presentation.
Thanks, Julie.
Thanks. Okay, can you see our slides now, everybody?
Yes, we can. I can, at least. I guess I shouldn't speak for everybody else.
Great. Well, thanks for being here today, everybody. We're excited to tell you a little bit about the Richard M. Daley Oral History Project. I'm here today with Dan Harper. He's the assistant archivist at Special Collections and University Archives at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and he works most closely with all the Daley family papers. My name is David Greenstein, and I'm a lecturer in Special Collections at UIC. And we just wanted to note that we're two out of many people who worked on this project, and so we're going to talk today about our views, but I don't know if everyone else agrees with us necessarily. So we just wanted to note that, and that we're two out of a lot of the people that work on the project, from videographers to the librarians that are managing the digital files. And today we were going to give you a little overview of the project, a little introduction to it, talk about some of the goals, and then I'll turn it over to Dan and tell us about some of the practical decisions that we had to make and on some of the content that we worked with and things like that. And then hopefully we'll leave some time at the end where we can all discuss and share some questions as well. So currently the Richard M. Daley Oral History Project, it has 45 interviews total. And these are interviews with colleagues, friends, family of former Mayor Richard M. Daley, who served 1989 and 2011 as the mayor of Chicago. And we interviewed most of his chiefs of staff, department heads that worked for the city, a couple critics of the mayor, but also other people in Chicago and national politics, including 2 U.S. presidents. And the interviews took place between 2017 and 2019, so it was about a 2-year-long project. And these interviews are part of the Daley family collections at UIC's Special Collections and University Archives. So we have the papers of both Richard J. Daley and Richard M. Daley, and there's already a Richard J. Daley oral history collection. So this complements that and adds to Richard M. Daley's papers. But you can see here in the blue box on the right too, there's several sets of papers we have also related to the Daley family or people around them, like Laszlo Kondor was Richard J. Daley's photographer, for example. And the library also has a focus on collecting other Chicago political papers, including the papers of the mayor. This oral history collection will fit into those other political collections that we have at the library. So there was an official goal for this project. This is the stated goal that was on the statement about the project that we gave to all the participants. That was to create a videotape archive of interviews with individuals whose memories of Chicago Mayor Richard M. Daley provide information and insight into Chicago's political, social, and economic and cultural history. But we also had several other goals in undertaking the project. One is donor relations and working with the Daley family and showing them that we're using and growing and providing access to their materials. We also wanted to work on creating a curated online exhibit that would use these video oral histories, and that's a project that's almost at completion now, that should be launching soon this year. And we also hope to learn for future oral history projects, including some that are already underway at the library as well. And then we also hope this would be an opportunity to work with the new digital asset management system that UIC library is using to store these files now. And Dan will talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation too. Oh, so now I'll turn it over to Dan, and he can tell us a little bit about some of the decisions that we made in conducting the project.
Okay, thanks, David. Yeah, we made, as you know, we made several decisions in doing the project. One of our first decisions was to outsource a lot of the jobs. We didn't outsource the skills, but we outsourced to people who had the skills. For the videos, for the transcriptions themselves, we hired an independent transcription service that did the first draft of each transcription, and they did a great job. We also hired the videographers who filmed and recorded almost all of the interviews, except for maybe a couple. The ones with the presidents usually had their own people do it. And then we also hired our own interviewer and scheduling assistant. The interviewer was important because it was somebody who had a relationship with the donors and was able to convince a lot of people to grant us interviews who may not have necessarily otherwise agreed to it. And the scheduling assistant was a big help because I don't know if you all had to schedule multiple interviews, but sometimes it could be hard to balance completing schedules. And so we outsourced a lot of that work ourselves. And then next slide, please. And then we did, of course, a lot of in-house work. This beautiful picture here that you see is something David found. And whenever somebody did an interview on site, we'd post these all over so people would know that there was a recording in process, and so they should be quiet. Ourselves, as I said, we outsourced the transcription process, but of course we needed to edit it, and each transcript went through at least two rounds of editing, just to make sure that a lot of the names were right and that some ambiguities were cleared up. And as I just implied, we did almost all of the interviews on site at UIC. Again, the presidents were an exception. They didn't want to come all the way to UIC to the library to be interviewed, and there were a few other people who were interviewed at their home. And we are doing our own digital storage through the dams that we hope to create, or that we're in the process of transitioning to. I'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end, but we're fortunate that we have a digital programs department that is helping us with the digital storage. And finally, we created our own metadata, and we're also fortunate in that we have our own cataloging department, which was able to help us with that as well. So we had to do a lot of in-house work, even as we outsourced some of the other work for which many of us didn't have the skills. Next slide, please. And one decision we made, and we've learned this as a lesson from past interviews or past oral history projects, is that we did not allow the interviewees to read over their transcripts and approve them. This was a big time saver. In past oral history projects we had inherited, the initial agreements had been that the interviewee would be allowed to review their transcripts and edit them, sometimes to a very great extent, and we did not allow our interviewees to do that. If an interviewee really did have an objection, we probably would have pulled the interview for them, but that never happened. And so the transcriptions we have and the interviews we have are available to the public. Next slide, please. And to turn over from our decision-making process to the content of the interviews, I think that probably the best glimpse that this gives into the history of Chicago during the time that Richard M. Daley was mayor, from 1989 to 2011, it gives a glimpse of what I guess I would call maybe a little loosely neoliberal governance, which involves privatization of many city services, experimenting with some aspect of community policing, reforming or revising public housing, engaging in what they consider to be school reform, and largely along charter school lines or maybe private school lines or some sort of public-private thing, and addressing what when I say they, I mean Richard M. Daley and the people who worked with him, consider to be a new emerging economy where there are fewer manufacturing jobs and more service sector jobs, some very low paying, but some very high paying, and trying to grapple with how to prepare Chicago to deal with that. And then I put services on again, just because there was also an ostensible focus on providing city services to citizens. Next slide, please.
Oh, yes.
And I did not prepare enough ahead of time to be able to show you these clips, but we put the clips in the presentation anyway. This is one of the people we interviewed. Her name was Sarah Ping, and she was a deputy chief of staff. If I were able to present the interview, she'd be talking about how Mayor Richard M. Daley was focused on city services to build up what she called goodwill in order to weather the bad times when people were maybe not as satisfied with him. They at least had certain they at least had some positive experience with city government for the times when city government didn't work that he could draw off on. Next slide, please. The one thing that you'll notice in these interviews is a discussion of some of the, I guess I would call them controversies. Some are maybe more hiccups and some are much more serious. One thing here that needs explanation is MBEs. That was sort of a controversy over the minority contracting program that the city of Chicago had. It appeared in the late 1990s that a lot of business owners used front persons to get minority contracts, even though the business itself was not essentially minority owned. So that was one scandal that emerged during Mayor Daley's tenure. Another thing that many of you have heard of, the hired truck scandal, which I won't go into detail, but that was also discussed in several of the interviews. And the 1995 Chicago heat wave, where as many as maybe 700 or 800 people perished in the heat wave of July 1995 was also discussed by a few interviewees. And then the most common controversies that were discussed in these interviews were Mayor Daley's decision to order Meigs Field Airport to be destroyed in the middle of night to make way for Northerly Island Park, and his decision in late 2007 into 2008 to privatize the city's parking meters. That had a lot of comment from the interviewees. Some very critical, some not so critical, but those are some of the controversies you're likely to see if you go through all the videos yourself. And then this is another slide we would have presented, and this is from Alderman Helen Shiller, who is one of the two really staunch critics of the mayor that we had a chance to interview. There were other people who offered critical insights, but she, along with activist Don Rose, were the two people who had very consistently critical things to say about the mayor. And in this clip, she would have been talking about how, in her opinion, Mayor Daley's efforts to experiment with community policing tended to be more divisive than conciliatory or in search of what she believed would be a just outcome for communities. And she makes the point that, in her opinion, these community policing strategies tended to privilege white perspectives and the perspectives of more affluent middle-class people over those who were poorer or more marginalized. Next slide, please. Another observation about the content is that it has what you might call an insider bias. To be clear, the donors, the Daley family, they wanted a well-rounded historical account in these interviews. They didn't want to whitewash. They didn't forbid us or exercise any sort of control over who we interviewed or the questions that were asked or whatnot. But we did make some decisions. Some of the decisions I mentioned earlier did create sort of what we consider a bias. One is the interviewer we hired, as I said, was a former colleague of the mayor, and he had his own narrative that he liked to push in the interviews. If you listen to the interviews, you'll hear the types of questions he asked. Some of them you might say are leading questions, trying to elicit a certain answer. But even he also asked the interviewees to relate their own criticisms of maybe what the mayor had. But still, he had the perspective of somebody who had worked for the mayor and was largely sympathetic to the programs of the mayors and to the actions of most of the people that he interviewed. And also another element of this insider bias is our own focus on securing the opinions of people who worked with the mayor over those who maybe were community activists or other people who might have had observations to make about the mayor's governance. So we focused on his colleagues more than we necessarily focused on more marginalized voices, and as a result, we did not capture those voices, but we presented the perspective of what I would call the neoliberal administrators who help put the mayor's policies into focus. And then next slide, please. And this would have been just one example of that insider bias. Gery Chico, who many of you might remember, ran for mayor a couple of times. In this clip, he defends the parking meter privatization, and many of the interviewees we talked to did defend the privatization of the parking meter, though many also criticized it as well. Next slide, please. And then just some reflections. There were some contingencies, as always, expect the unexpected. As we said at the beginning, one of our goals for this project was to experiment with our new dams, which was LibNova. It's been a long transition, and we're still not quite there yet. And instead of being able to provide public access to these interviews through LibNova, we have decided to make use of Carly's content DM system. And so I put the link into the chat when David started the presentation, and it's there that you can access the interviews in PDF versions of the transcript. We do hope in about a year, maybe sometime next summer, to have a beta version of LibNova accessible to the public. It may be sometime after that before we can actually make the videos themselves accessible through LibNova, at which time we also hope, knock on wood, to have OHMS, the oral history metadata synchronizer, to allow you to view transcripts side by side the video. That's something we're working on. But the transition to our new dams has been a little more complicated than envisioned, and has just frankly taken a lot longer than we had thought. So we did have a few minor equipment malfunctions, and that created some hiccups in the interviewing process, and we learned from that. And after that happened, we had 2 ways to record the interview instead of just one. And finally, the pandemic is the elephant in the room. We were already mostly done with the oral history interviews. We still theoretically could have gotten a few more, but the pandemic pretty much put an end to our ability to call people over to do an in-person interview, and we did not choose to do remote interviews. It was a little bit of blessing in disguise because we were outside of the archives, and we had to pivot from working from home, and because most of the interviews had been done, it was very easy to work on that as opposed to other things that might have taken our time. The pandemic did make it more difficult for us to finish the online curated exhibit that Daley mentioned, or that David mentioned, not Daley. And it was originally scheduled to be finished sometime last summer, and now we're looking, as David said, in maybe a month or 2 to have it finished. Next slide, please. And another reflection that I have to offer is that it really helped to have the resources of a big institution like UIC. Being able to hire a transcription service, being able to pay money to an interviewer and to a scheduler, and being able to hire a videographer cost a lot of money. And I don't have the exact figures here to disclose to you, but it was probably more than a lot of smaller institutions would have available to them. We also have the advantages of a highly competent business office at UIC who helped us manage these things to be consistent with the university's mandate and ethical obligations, and it was a big help to have them. And we had dedicated staff, as we alluded to, in the digital programs department and in the cataloging department, who helped us do things that that maybe archivists like myself and David would not have had the experience for or have the expertise for. And we also had several graduate student workers who helped us do especially the transcript editing and also some of the daily planning for the interviews. We're really grateful for their help, but again, it's also an example of the resources that we as a large institution had that maybe a lot of smaller institutions just don't have. And then next slide, please. And then we have more plans for the future. You'll see a lot of these plans are things that we planned for what it would now be the past, but we're now planning them for the future. And one is to move, as I said, the videos and the transcriptions over to our new digital asset management system. One is to finally finish the curated online exhibit. And another is to work on new oral history collections, some of which are actually legacy collections that were done several years ago, in one case maybe 20 or so years ago. And now we have to do it with tighter budgets, so we're starting to learn a little bit what it's like not to have the types of resources that we were able to have for this particular collection. And then David, he might be able to speak a little more of this to this, is that we're using these interviews along with the collections for coursework. But David knows more about that, and he can maybe chime in on that.
Yeah, and I'd be happy to answer questions about that if there are any, but we're using these oral histories this semester in a course where students usually work with physical materials in the archives, but because they're not able to, it's great to have an online resource that's so rich that they're able to use in that course, so that's great. Oh,
that wraps it up. and we'd like to hear your questions.
All right, I see there is one question in the chat. Here we've got, were there any key Daley era figures that told you up front that they didn't want to be interviewed or participate in the project, and if so, whom?
There were a few, but we were not able to disclose them. Some were at least one was a close advisor. Or two, actually, I would say at least were close advisors. We also had one potentially strong critical voice who also opted somewhat at the last minute not to be interviewed as well. And again, because they haven't given us permission to disclose it, we unfortunately can't disclose that.
All right, while people are thinking of questions, I just want to say that the technical issues with showing the embedded videos were probably the fault of the moderator not knowing how to make that work. So the video interviews are available. If you would like to point people to, I see Dan put a link in the chat to collections.carleyillinois.edu. So is that where all of the interviews would be found?
That is correct, yes. And if you do run into hiccups, like a video file doesn't work or whatever, please contact us at UIC, because it's probably us and not you that needs to tweak up or fix the video files. We've gotten around 99% of all the quirks fixed, but there's undoubtedly some that might not work on some systems, and we'd appreciate your help if you notice something that does not work.
All right. I have another question here. Would you consider doing interviews where access is restricted for a certain amount of years in order to obtain interviews of the reluctant people?
That's certainly a strategy, and David might also comment on this too. It's something, as you probably know, would be it's more of a hassle. It creates the problem that if we restrict it for 20 years, maybe 5 years from now, we'll forget about the restriction, and then 10 years from now, we'll make it available 10 years too early or whatever. But yeah, I think we would theoretically consider that. And that was not something we, to my knowledge, approached any interviewee with any potential interviewee with, and that may have been one of the causes for those people who declined not to be interviewed. But it's certainly something that would be theoretically on the table. I don't know if David has any more to add about that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd say, I wasn't at the library yet at that time, but I think that in the past there have been problems with when you give interviewees a lot of control over the process, like for example, letting them edit transcripts afterwards and things like that, or place these kinds of restrictions. Then it makes a lot of individual rules that are different for different people, and that gets very complicated quickly. If we had let people, for example, edit the transcripts afterwards, then you have to somehow edit videos as well, and then you're holding up the whole project. Sometimes that can take quite a long time. And the advantage of having the same rules and for everybody was that we were able to start and finish with a little bit more control, I think, too.
Okay, our next question. Could you talk more about some of the difficulties you're having with setting up your new digital asset management system?
I wish I could, but there's so much that I just don't know about it. That one of the advantages of having such a large institution is that that difficulty is kind of pushed off into another department. So I can only speak in general terms. Going into our efforts to acquire the new dams, which actually began, as I understand it, several years ago, like maybe 3 or 4 more years ago. We had, I believe, on various servers and out in the internet, we had maybe a 1.5 million individual digital objects out in existence, and we didn't. That undoubtedly played a big role in trying to coordinate everything to go into this new dams. I would be willing to bet pretty good money that more than half of those digital objects are probably copies of each other or otherwise stuff that we don't necessarily want to keep. But it was something that our digital programs department really had to work through. Another issue is that being a government bureaucracy, we have a lot of rules to go by. This had more to do with the acquiring of the dams and not necessarily the migration process, but it took a while just to get all the contracts settled and before we could make the actual effort to purchase the dams. But for the more technical aspects of it, it's something I'm not very well equipped to comment on. I don't know if David has anything more to say about that or not.
I don't think so.
Any other questions? Has anybody else on the call here had experience with anything they might want to add on as their experience in setting up your new digital asset management system or working with oral histories and conducting interviews? If you'd rather talk than type, you can just unmute yourself and speak up. All right, I guess if we don't have any more questions, thank you so much. This presentation was wonderful.
Thank you, we appreciate it.
Right.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to exploring the collection. So thank you to Dan and to David. Our next presentation is set to start at 10 past 11. So we've got a little bit of a break between then. So think of questions. If you have stuff that you think of after the fact, you can always email, put it in the chat. I'll make sure that it gets to the presenters. And we will see you a little bit after 11 o'clock.
Thank you very much.